Is the fact that other people are going to continue to exist after we die make our own deaths not so bad? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Recently, I got a request from a viewer to review an article called Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity by philosopher Thomas Clark. So that's what I thought we'd do today. I'll give you a brief rundown of what the article says, and then I'll give you my thoughts on it. The article starts off by defining the term personal subjective continuity, and that is the subjective sense of always having been present. And I'm going to throw on there insofar as it is had by a person, right? And that because there's a different kind of subjective continuity that comes later on that the author talks about. So what does that mean? Well, Clark points out that we have a subjective experience that might be broken up by, let's say, like going to sleep. You know, you're conscious for a while, you go to sleep, and you're no longer conscious for a particular period of time, assuming you don't have any dreams, and then you're conscious again. But notice in that you don't actually have an experience of not being conscious, right? Subjectively speaking, you go from the moment before you are no longer conscious to the moment after you gain consciousness again, without any gap in between. No experiential gap in between. Now, objectively speaking, of course, there is a gap, but there's no gap insofar as your experience is concerned. And the same goes for what happens before you're born and after you die. You don't experience anything that happened before you're born. You don't experience anything that happened after you die. So far as you're concerned, subjectively speaking, so far as your experience is concerned, you always have been present. Every time you've been conscious, you have been present during that consciousness, and you've never had a time of being conscious where you were not present. So it wouldn't even make sense to have that. So subjectively speaking, there are no gaps between our subjective experiences. So that's what he calls personal subjective continuity. The fact that there's no gap in between your subjective experiences, that they are a constant instantaneous transition from one subjective experience to the next one. Clark goes on to point out that PSC, as I'll call it, personal subjective continuity, is maintained across significant changes to a person. So he imagines a person named TC, and TC, let's say, decides to get frozen and get unfrozen years later when, let's say, technology is better and TC can enjoy life or something. And when TC, the moment before TC is frozen, TC is experiencing, the subjective sense of being present. And then TC's frozen, and then TC was reanimated. TC immediately feels that subjective sense of being present again without experiencing that gap in between, right? That frozen gap, just like when you go to sleep. There is no gap there, so TC maintains PSC across that frozen period of time. And now we can imagine altering TC partially. Imagine you change something about TC, let's say a little bit about his personality. We make TC a little bit angrier, right? Do something with his brain so that he's angrier all the time. And we see that when he comes out the other side, TC is a little different. Call that TC mod. And TC mod still would maintain PSC, right? It's still the case that starting off from that moment before being frozen to the moment right after being unfrozen, there would be this, subjective continuity that TC and TC mod contain. Now, the next step is a little bit harder to see, and that is that some kind of subjective continuity is had across not only changes to a person, but changes of a person. And this is, let's say that we had TC, and TC is frozen, and TC is changed significantly to the point where we would say that's no longer a person, or should say no longer the same person. Now, call that new person TC rad. Is there a subjective continuity between the two? Clark says yes, and he appeals to an argument from vagueness. So he says that, if we were to say that, if, we said that TC changing to TC mod was okay, that the PSC was maintained across that kind of a change, then you can imagine this change from TC to TC rad should be no different, right? That we still should have at least some kind of subjective continuity. Note, it wouldn't be personal subjective continuity because you wouldn't have the same person. We're saying that you've changed persons. But there would be some kind of subjective continuity because you would have the subjective experience, you would have no gap, and then you would have another subjective experience. I think that's what his argument is. I think it's an appeal to vagueness. So I think you could put the argument a little bit stronger by saying, imagine TC mod 1, and we change something slightly about TC, and we reanimate him. Still the same, PSC is still going through that change. TC mod 2, change it a little bit slightly more. TC mod 3, keep changing TC mod by slight amounts until we get TC mod, let's say 9999. And then the next step would be TC rad. Just changing just a little bit more would change us into a new person. Now, changing from TC 9998 to TC 9999, we still had a subjective continuity. Wouldn't it be the case that changing from TC 9999 to TC rad, we should have subjective continuity as well? That would be an argument from vagueness. And it sounds to me like that's what he's appealing to. The next step in the argument is to say, well, if we can have this subjective continuity between two different people, TC and TC rad, then of course we could have this subjective continuity between any two people, right? Anybody and a person that comes after them could have a subjective continuity. And all you would need is to have a subjective sense of always having been present, no gap where you experience, a subjective sense of not having been present, and then another subjective sense of always having been present. So there's no gap between those two subjective senses, so then the two must be a continuity in some manner. This is what Clark defines as general subjective continuity. It's this same subjective sense of always having been present, but had by a string of people or a set of people, something like that. Now, the fact that this is a continuity is supposed to give us some kind of solace when we consider our deaths. And now, Clark is a naturalist, atheist, believes that there is no such thing as an afterlife. When you die, you just no longer exist. The moment you die, in fact, he's very adamant about this. There's no sort of existing as nothingness. That is an error, and I think he's very right about this. That's just an erroneous way of looking at it. There's no such thing as nothing. So it's not like you're existing in nothingness. It's that you just don't exist. You cease to exist altogether. And that's very depressing if you think about it. So, how are we to console ourselves? He says, well, look, we're part of this kind of continuity, this subjective continuity between us and the people that come afterwards. So at the very least, we can console ourselves with saying that, he doesn't say we will live on. In fact, he's very careful not to say stuff like that. But you could say in a metaphorically flowery language, we will continue to live on insofar as we are part of this continuity. But it's important for him to note that, it's not like there is an actual connection that I have with people that come after me. We don't have a real, here's my subjectivity, I'm handing it off to you. That doesn't happen. So there's Clark's article in a nutshell. Let me give you my thoughts about it now. Personally, I'm not very convinced. I think there are a few problems with the article. A major problem, I think, is that I don't think GSC is an actual type of continuity. And here's what I mean. I think in order to have a continuity, you need to have, first of all, at least two different elements, which I think, as an aside, I think there's a problem with the way PSC is articulated, because it says that, you have a subjective continuity, personal subjective continuity, as long as you have a subjective sense of always having been present. But imagine a possible world in which someone, like one person, gains consciousness for one moment and then is snuffed out. So there's only one moment of consciousness. Well, that person would have a subjective sense of always having been present in that one moment, right? They're never going to have the experience of not having been present. So by that definition, they have personal subjective continuity, and yet, does it make sense to say continuity when you don't have two moments at the very least? That, there should be some kind of continuity between moments. So I think PSC probably needs to be modified a little bit. But that's kind of an aside. First, you need at least two elements, and second, you need something that is the same between the two elements, something that is identical, that they share. Otherwise, you don't have a continuity. What you have is one thing, the cessation of that one thing, and a totally new thing, and that's not a continuity, that's just an ordering. So what kinds of things do continuities have in common? One kind of a thing would be a causal history. So this is something that a team might have. If you consider, for example, the Lakers, they were once the Minneapolis Lakers, and they were made up of a group of individuals, and they were located in Minneapolis, and now they're located in Los Angeles with a wholly, totally different new people, right? Yet we would say that there is a continuity in this team. There is a continuity from the very beginning of the Lakers organization to today, even though, not materially speaking, there's nothing in common between the two things. And why is that? Because there's a causal history that they have in common. So there's one type of thing that a continuity can have that is the same. Another type of thing is an entity. So for example, a continuity of a life. A life is a continuity because it is had by a particular entity, a person, right? The person is the same throughout all the different moments of the life. So the life is a continuity. Now, for PSC, there is an entity that is in common, that is the person, right? That's why it's a personal subjective continuity, because it's the same person that's having the subjective experience of always having been present. When it comes to GSC, though, there's not something that they share in common. In fact, the only thing that they share in common is that they're the same types of things, right? They're the type of thing, subjective experience, and another type of thing, subjective experience. And that's what they have in common, but they don't have anything in between them that they actually share. Now, one possible confusion here is that we could think that maybe it's the subjective experience itself that is continuous throughout. And I think that Clark kind of uses language that would lend itself to this confusion when he says stuff like the continuity, what is it, like subjective continuity, but in different contexts, right? Meaning context, meaning different people having subjective continuity, right? So I have subjective continuity. That is the context in which subjective continuity is happening. And then I die and somebody else has it. And that's the context in which subjective continuity is being had there. So that sounds like the subjective continuity is being shared between us, right? That there is a same thing, subjective continuity, that flows like from one person to the next person. But that's expressly not what Clark means. Clark is very clear that he's a naturalist and that kind of stuff is mystical and that he's not down for it. In fact, I'm not sure that that even makes sense, because to say that a subjective experience could go from one person to the next person, well, by their very nature, subjective experiences are first person. So how could it go from one person to another? They wouldn't be able to go from one person to the next person. So I don't think that would be possible in the first place. Now, you might point out that between TC and TC rad, there was something in common, and that was the entity, the body, right? The body of TC and TC rad is the same. That's true. I think, unfortunately, that gives us the wrong kind of continuity, though. The kind of continuity we have in between TC and TC rad is not a subjective continuity. It's not like the subjective experience of TC is passed along to TC rad. That those are two different persons, so they have two different subjective experiences. No, instead what happens is that you have the same thing, the body, causing subjective experience of TC, and later on causing the subjective experience of TC rad. So the activity is the same, right? It's a continuity in the activity of causing subjective experiences that the body has, but it's not a continuity of subjectivity. So I think it gives us the wrong kind of continuity. But even if that weren't the case, even if I were wrong about that, at the very least, Clark wants this to apply beyond these bizarre cases of TC and TC rad, so it wouldn't really help in the first place. So as I said, GSE doesn't have an entity that is identical between the two things. It doesn't have a causal history that's identical between the two subjectivities. So even though there is a subjectivity and there is no like gap that is experienced, and then there's another subjectivity, that doesn't mean that there's a continuity between the two things. In fact, I think a second objection that I could levy here is that this is analogous to what we would say about two spatiotemporally isolated universes. So if we had, let's say, two spatiotemporally isolated universes, they have nothing in common space and time-wise, we would say that they are totally discontinuous, right? And yet, there is no gap between the two of them. There is no space that is separating the two. Otherwise, they would actually be, connected. There's no time that is between the two. It's not like one is before the other or after the other. They're isolated from each other. So they're not like temporally connected. So you have a spatiotemporal universe. You have another spatiotemporal universe. And there isn't really a nothing that is separating the two, right? Nothingness doesn't exist. That's not a real thing. So there is no gap, so to speak, between the two. But that doesn't mean that we would call that a continuity. In fact, we would call that very discontinuous. And the same thing would go for the subjectivity. You have a subjectivity, you have another subjectivity, and the two of them are not connected in any way. Sure, there's no gap in between them that is disconnecting them, but that doesn't make them a continuity. A further problem, I think, is that the argument from vagueness is weak. And I'm not saying that this specific argument from vagueness is weak, but just arguments from vagueness in general are weak arguments. So the argument goes something like this, remember, saying TC to TC mod was sufficient to say that it was a subjective continuity. Just going a little bit further and saying TC to TC rad, why not say that's also a subjective continuity? But using that same logic, we could prove instead that TC rad is identical to TC. And here's what I mean by that. TC to TC mod is still the same person. Remember, I changed it and I said TC mod 1, right? Just change them a little bit. TC mod 2, just change them a little bit more. TC mod 3. TC mod 9998, still TC. TC mod 99999, still TC. TC rad, all of a sudden, is a different person? Can we really justify that small step from TC mod 9999 to TC rad being a different person, when the step from TC mod 9998 to TC mod 9999 did not make a different person? It seems like TC rad should be the same person. I'm not saying that he is the same person. I'm saying that arguments from vagueness don't really prove very much, because you could argue from vagueness all over the place. If it's possible for us to say, no, there's a cutoff, TC mod becomes TC rad, and that's a different person, and I don't care, we can't really tell where it is, but there is a spot where there's a different person, then why can't we say, okay, there is subjective continuity between TC and TC mod, but there is a point somewhere along there where there is no longer subjective continuity. it seems like we should be able to do the same thing there. One issue that I'm not totally sure is a problem. I think probably you could finagle this to find some kind of solution for, is that I'm not sure how GSC is not had between people who are contemporaneous. How is it that you and I are not having general subjective continuity? All it takes is having a subjective sense of always having been present, having no subjective gap between, and then another person having a subjective sense of always having been present. Well, isn't that what everybody enjoys between each other? And so I think maybe you would try to add some kind of chronological ordering, saying some kind of, like one is in the past and one is in the present or something like that. But then you might come into a problem with, I, in moment one, have a PSC, I have a subjective continuity, right? I have this sense of always having been present. And you, in moment two, also have this subjective sense of always having been present. So we're chronologically ordered, and it looks like we would have GSC then, but that's weird, right? Like saying that we have GSC and we're just a moment apart and we both exist at the same time. Seems kind of strange. I don't know, maybe Clark would have no problem with saying that we all have this kind of continuity. Even present day people have this kind of continuity. It seems like he's arguing this in order for us to look in perpetuity, right, and say that our descendants are the ones that are continuous with us. So maybe that's all that he wanted, and he wouldn't like this idea, but maybe he wouldn't care. But I'm not even sure that it would be a problem. Like, there might be some way of formulating this where this doesn't come up. So I just think it's interesting, so I brought it up. But a final objection, I think, is devastating, and that is that, let's say that I'm wrong about GSC, and GSC is an actual continuity, and that it's something that we enjoy between ourselves and our descendants. And let's even say, because one problem that I don't know he didn't really mention is the fact that the universe is going to die a heat death, so that all life will be extinct, so that even if we continue to exist in this GSC type way, then it's not going to be for very long. But let's say that we could have a universe that didn't ever have that happen to us. Well, the whole point of this is to be comforting in the face of personal extinction. And personally, I don't think it's successful in doing so. And here's why. Imagine that you have your entire life ahead of you, right? You're young, and that somehow you're never going to die. Well, not you're never going to die. You're not going to die until your old age, and you're going to have a full and healthy life. All those things. But you also know that at the end of your life, the universe is going to cease to exist. Something's going to happen, and the universe will end. And let's say you're looking at your life ahead of you, and someone comes to you and offers you this proposition and says, look, I realize that the universe is going to cease to exist. And the big thing about this is the universe is going to cease to exist and nothing else will exist afterwards. So you're not going to have any GSC. You're going to die, and there's not going to be anything. There won't be this sense of comfort. In other words, there won't be this kind of subjective continuity that you have with you people that come after you. And let's say that this person comes to you and offers you and says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to create a world billions of years from now that will have conscious people, so that you will have this general subjective continuity with these people. And this universe that I'm going to create that will be spatio-temporally connected to your universe, because I think that's a problem. If it's not, then I don't think that we can have GSC, but that's a whole different issue. But this universe will go on forever. So it'll be an eternal universe, so that you'll never have to worry about, the heat death of the universe or anything like that. The only thing is, the universe as it exists will have to end today. You won't get that full life. So your choices are a full life, but no GSC, or no full life, but you live forever in GSC. Which would you choose? I don't think anybody would choose GSC. I can't imagine anybody would. In fact, if somebody came to me and offered me that, and I was going to die, let's say the next day, let's say the universe were going to end like a day from now, and someone said, I'll take away one day of your life, this last day that you have with your family, I'll take this day away, but you could live forever through, having a general subjective continuity with people that are going to come billions of years from now. I would say no. I would say I'd rather have my day. Why? Because when I die, if Clark is right, when I die, I'm going to cease existing altogether. I'm just going to, there's going to be nothing. Clark's very good about pointing this out. It's not like I'm going to go somewhere and be sitting there in nothingness and be able to say like, well, I don't exist anymore, but at least I kind of exist through this GSC. No, you won't be there at all. Like, there's nothing to be in. You will be nothing. You will be that which rocks dream about, right? You will be total nothing. And that's not a thing. So I don't think it would be wise to give up any time. And I think part of what makes something valuable is what you're willing to give up for it. And if you're not willing to give up any time for something, that means it's not valuable at all. So I don't think this GSC is very valuable. And contrast that with, in full disclosure, here's what I believe. I believe that we can know through having faith in Jesus Christ that we will live forever with God in eternal happiness. Now, is that worth trading a day for? Yeah, I would trade a day for easily, right? That's worth trading the rest of your life for, even if you have a full life ahead of you, knowing that for eternity, you're going to have this full and happy eternal existence. That is something that is worth everything. It's worth all the marbles. Now, the big difference here is that Clark is a naturalist and atheist, so the Christian response is not available to him, right? There is going to be no eternal happiness after death on his perspective. And this article assumes naturalism, assumes that there is going to be extinction after death, so that, again, this Christian option is not open to him. So I don't bring that up to say that. I bring it up just to contrast what true hope looks like, and to see that GSC is just not true hope. GSC is not something to hope in, because, again, it's not worth anything. It's not something that you would actually give up anything for. It's something that I think you would try to delude yourself into thinking, well, I will in some way live on in perpetuity. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know how it's much different than just saying like, well, my atoms are going to continue to exist and they're going to go off and be stardust, and isn't that great? Okay, but I'm not going to exist anymore, so why should I care, right? I'm not going to be there to watch all this stuff happening, to watch my atoms becoming stardust and say, oh, isn't it great? I'm not going to be anywhere, so why should I care what happens after I die, whether I have this continuity or not? So I don't think the hope is available in that case. But then again, I think that there is real hope. And if you're interested in that, by the way, hit me up in the comments, and I'd love to talk to you more about it, because I think personally it's a life-changing kind of a thing. And it's something that I hope that everybody could have. Thank you very much, Anna Ruth, for suggesting this article. And I appreciate it and I enjoyed it. So I'll see you in the next video. Adios.